Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My remarks today will focus on the current and future military and geopolitical implications of global warming. Is climate change currently posing a threat to military readiness? Is it likely to in the future? Is it increasing the likelihood of conflicts that will lead to military battles or even war? A review of available research and data suggests the answer to each question is no. Climate and weather are just two of many variables that have always affected military planning and conflicts. Given what we know about the causes, pace of, and consequences of modern-day climate change, there's no reason to believe it poses a major problem today. Following recent Senate testimony during his confirmation for Secretary of Defense, General James Mattis was asked to respond in writing to questions by Senate Democrats about climate change and national security. He replied, "Climate change is impacting stability in areas of the world where our troops are operating today. It is appropriate for the combatant commands to incorporate drivers of instability that impact the security environment in their areas into their planning." Later in his remarks, he added, "I agree that the effects of a changing climate, such as increased maritime access to the Arctic, rising sea levels, desertification, among others, impact our security situation. I will ensure that the Department continues to be prepared to conduct operations today and in the future, and that we are prepared to address the effects of a changing climate on our threat assessments, resources, and readiness." The left-leaning media outlet ProPublica reported that Secretary Mattis' remarks may be a sign of breaking ranks with the Trump administration on the issue of climate change as a national priority. But when analyzing the remarks carefully, consider if the same question had been asked 10, 20, or even 50 years ago when carbon dioxide levels were far lower, would the answer be any different? Military planners have a duty to consider all contingencies, and a changing climate is and always has been one of them. Further, Mattis' remarks make no reference to humans as the cause of climate change, nor mention fossil fuels or carbon dioxide. A 2015 White House assessment on the national security implications of climate change stated, "A changing climate will act as an accelerant of instability around the world, exacerbating tensions relating to water scarcity and food shortages, natural resource competition, underdevelopment, and overpopulation. Climate change is a threat multiplier that will aggravate stressors abroad such as poverty, environmental degradation, political instability, and social tensions, conditions that enable terrorist activity and other forms of violence. The risk of conflict may increase." Given that this is the rationale for new policy, we should analyze the premises and their sources. The claims of severe climate threats are based on computer climate models of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, and as Heartland speakers at this and previous conferences have noted many times, as we saw Pat Michaels demolish them during the lunch keynote, the temperature projections have been greatly overstated and therefore the models are unreliable. This line of reasoning asks that we accept a series of premises each dependent on the prior one, namely that temperatures are rising at a dangerously unprecedented rate, that this is caused by human activity primarily from fossil fuel combustion, that such rise in temperature will trigger severe weather events, and most relevant to this discussion, these events will create instability in numerous areas so as to increase threats to national security. The main flaw as it relates to national security is that they assume causality between climate change and instability when there's very little evidence of such from the body of academic literature that has emerged on the subject. Furthermore, the case studies that are advancing the climate conflict theory suffer from numerous methodological errors. For example, they use untestable models that confuse dependent variables. There's a lack of control groups in the case studies. Reverse causality, such as when ongoing conflicts damage the environment and create resource scarcity rather than environmentally determined conflict. And an over-reliance on speculating on future conflicts rather than finding empirical evidence for their claim. I will now examine 5 sources of conflict allegedly resulting from climate change: water, famine, resource scarcity, refugee flows, and the Arctic region. A review of several academic studies on these issues shows that there's very tenuous support for their claims. Water is one of the most widely cited sources for conflict in the cases linking climate change with national security, whether it be due to floods, droughts, or other shortages, or poor water quality. The previous administration argued that these problems are a threat to U.S. bases and installations here and abroad. Professor Aaron Wolf conducted a study of 412 conflicts between 1918 and 1994 and only found 7 where water was even a partial cause. He wrote, "As near we can find, there has never been a single war fought over water. Numerous other recent studies have yielded similar results, concluding that ethnic and political causes of conflict are most common." This should actually come as a little surprise when we consider water as a shared resource that easily flows across borders. It is exceedingly difficult to control water supplies, and the economic incentives for those downstream and upstream are far greater to cooperate rather than enter into conflict, and there are countless examples of long-standing treaties and agreements between political groups concerning water resources and borders. In 2012, a group of academics tested climate change scenarios regarding water resources and Israeli-Palestinian relations. They noted an unintended consequence of the climate conflict theory in that, ironically, quote, "Ironically, the climate security literature may do more to militarize environmental crises by characterizing them as security challenges and thereby prompting decision makers to turn from cooperative or diplomatic solutions and towards military options," close quote. Introducing this new context in an unstable situation may actually worsen it. I went ahead there, but researchers have also looked at specific cases in Central Asia and throughout Africa and found little evidence suggesting future conflicts arising from water usage. Now, as I've shown on this slide, famine is another climate variable suggested as a source for war. The immediate fact to consider is that we are living in an age of record food production thanks to amazing technological innovations in the past century, with crop yields rising across a wide range of commodities. Climate alarmists warn that rising temperatures and water shortages from climate change will reduce crop yields, yet we see no evidence of this happening. Furthermore, this ignores several key points. Technology has allowed us to expand food production at unprecedented rates, so why wouldn't we expect technology to adapt agricultural practices to a changing climate? Secondly, as my colleague Craig Itzo just elaborated, carbon dioxide is plant food. There's far more evidence suggesting that an increase in carbon dioxide will result in a greening of the planet rather than crop failures and food shortages, and should we experience a warming climate, it will increase the amount of arable land. Lastly, the very policies being promoted to lower greenhouse gas emissions would be a major hindrance to food production due to higher energy prices. Modern agricultural processes rely heavily on fossil fuels, and many fertilizers and pesticides are petroleum-based. On the subject of affordable energy, a 2005 report by the U.S. Agency for International Development found direct links between cheap energy, economic growth, and stability. Surveying 93 countries, the researchers observed that access to affordable energy and economic growth increased the odds of peace by a factor of 2.5, and an increase in energy consumption raises the probability for stability by a factor of 1.5. This clearly supports the argument that to achieve peace and security, we should be pursuing policies that aim to lower energy prices, not increase them. The original factor advanced in the climate conflict hypothesis is resource scarcity, with the notion that an environment degraded by climate change will result in instability and conflict as nations fight over a diminishing resource base. Independent of climate change, this is not a new theory, and although scholars have found limited examples of conflict over mineral resources when other factors are involved, a 2011 study concluded that, in modern times, no interstate conflicts have been driven by depletion of mineral resources. As we've seen in our previous examples, the same arguments hold true. Thanks largely to technological innovation and market forces, we've witnessed unparalleled food production and improvements in resource extraction technology, such as the recent boom in hydraulic fracturing. Advances in international trade have greatly improved global supply chains to move commodities where they are needed. Many of these claims are based on the same discredited Malthusian predictions, such as the peak oil scare in recent years, and the claims in the 1970s book, Limits to Growth, that the supply of most commodity metals and minerals would be depleted by the past decade or two. And again, as we saw with water, academic studies have found that cooperation is far more likely than conflict in the case of resource scarcity. War is very expensive and highly unpredictable. Gains from trade and cooperation should be clear in all but the most extreme cases. We will now consider the widely discussed yet ill-defined and theoretical concept of climate refugees as a source of conflict, which are people displaced as a result of environmental catastrophes due to climate change. The most widely cited reference to this comes from a 2009 report from the Environmental Justice Foundation predicting 150 million climate refugees by 2050. An earlier prediction that there would be 50 million climate refugees by 2010 was endorsed by the United Nations, and they were obviously mugged by reality, as we can see 7 years later today. The main flaw in this argument is that it is entirely predictive and based on future speculation, with empirical evidence showing that people very rarely resort to violence when faced with environmental catastrophe. As Dr. Bruno Bertré wrote in a 2011 Washington Quarterly article, quote, "Such are the reasons why experts of environmental migrations generally agree that climate change in itself is rarely a root cause of migration. Major population displacements due to environmental and/or climatic factors will remain exceptional except in the case of a sudden natural disaster. And most importantly, for the sake of this analysis, they are rarely a cause of violent conflict." The Arctic is the final source of an alleged conflict claim for which, again, there is little support. The theory goes that melting sea ice will open new shipping lanes, creating opportunities for conflict. The first counterpoint is that the United States and Soviet Union were both operating militarily in the region throughout the Cold War, with far more unstable periods than the current. Secondly, recent research has found that the defense presence in the 5 Arctic nations of Canada, Denmark, Norway, Russia, and the United States is territorial policing in nature, not force projection. Beyond the realm of academic theory, we have an actual case of climate change-driven policy in the U.S. military, the Navy's Farm-to-Fleet Biofuels program. We must appreciate that energy is the lifeblood of our military in the form of gasoline, JP5 yellow kerosene jet fuel, and F-76 military diesel. There exists no global reservoir of alternative fuels, nor will there be for the foreseeable future. In 2011, President Obama directed the Navy to use biofuels for the sake of energy diversification. There was no efficiency, power output, or cost advantage in this decision. Following its maiden voyage, the Green Fleet came under heavy Republican scrutiny for the prohibitive cost of its 50% biofuel blend fuel, $27 per gallon versus $3.60 a gallon for traditional fuel. Senator McCain's office issued a report last year that found the U.S. Navy spent $58.6 million on alternative fuel between 2007 and 2014 at an average of $29.30 per gallon. The choice to spend millions of dollars in our already exhausted defense budget on a ridiculously expensive fuel with no performance advantage speaks volumes about the priorities of the last administration. I'll finish my presentation with the statement of Jeff Skeeter, formerly with the George Marshall Institute, explaining why linking climate change with national security is bad policy. Quote, "In summary, efforts to link climate change to the deterioration of U.S. national security rely on improbable scenarios, imprecise and speculative methods, and scant empirical support. Accepting the connection can lead to the dangerous expansion of U.S. security concerns, inappropriately applied resources, and diversion of attention for more effective responses to known environmental challenges. The danger of this approach is that it offers a sense of urgency which may not be warranted, given the gaps in current state of knowledge about climate, the known flaws in the methods used to construct the scenarios on which these security scenarios are based, and confusion over the underlying causes of those security concerns," end quote. The mission of the Department of Defense is, and I quote from the DoD webpage, quote, "to provide the military forces needed to deter war and to protect the security of our country," end quote. Directing our military leaders to focus their attention on a highly politicized debate that ultimately rests on atmospheric carbon dioxide levels from fossil fuel emissions is the ultimate case of mission creep and sets a dangerous precedent. We should abandon this gravely misguided policy and return to the core focus of the military, protecting the nation and winning wars when we must fight them. Thank you for your time.